Dana, I am quite surprised how strong the headline number is. Can you just walk me through your assessment of these numbers?
Sure, absolutely. Consumer confidence did tick up in September, and we think a lot of that's a reflection of three things. Number one, most people are still working. We've seen very strong job gains, and labor force participation among core workers, people aged 25 to 64, is rising. The second thing is that wages are rising almost across the board. So folks are quitting, they're finding better jobs and higher wages. And then the third thing is that inflation expectations have been cooling off a bit. And certainly that's a reflection of lower gasoline prices. So taking those things together, consumers are feeling a little bit better.
Mm-hmm. Is this a good news, bad news, though, situation? Like, this is exactly the scenario that you laid out, with the exception of inflation expectations rolling over that the Fed doesn't want to see.
Well, I don't think the Fed wants to see unhappy people, but certainly the Fed wants to bring down inflation. And when you look at inflation gauges, food prices are still rising, rents are through the roof, and costs for many services are also elevated. That has not improved. And so that's why we haven't seen a massive improvement in consumer confidence.
Well, just to pick up on Alix's point, though, Dana, the Fed has made it very clear that it is going to have to cause some pain in the labor market. What you're telling me at the moment is that that pain is yet to show up.
Yes, that's correct. I mean, our own forecasts, we have been saying for a while that we do expect a recession in the U.S. because the Fed is raising interest rates aggressively and to very elevated levels. That is going to cause some pain in the labor market, but we're probably not going to see 5, 6, 7, 8% unemployment. It's probably going to be closer to 4, 4.5%. And that's because of the massive labor shortages and the fact that we don't have a good supply of workers right now.
So is 4.5 to 5, which is what Charlie Evans also sort of intimated overnight, is that enough to bring inflation down to 2%? Or is inflation going to have to live somewhere around 3%?
Well, our own forecasts have inflation kind of settling closer to 3% by the end of next year and not really getting to 2% until 2024. So I think the Fed really does need to bring interest rates to a very high level and keep them there in order to bring inflation down. But let's remember, inflation is being driven by supply and demand factors. The Fed can address the demand factors. They really need those supply factors to cooperate with what they're doing.
Dana, we are seeing a slowing housing market. I think that's fair to say, despite the fact we've just seen some cracking numbers coming through that Alix brought us. The housing market is starting to show the impact of higher mortgage rates. What is the relationship between higher mortgage rates and consumer confidence?
Sure. So certainly if you're looking to buy a house, it's going to make you feel a little bit sour, certainly. But we've already in the second quarter, we saw the housing market starting to slow as a reflection of very elevated prices, people getting priced out, but also because mortgage rates are rising because the Fed's raising interest rates. But that's all part of the plan. The Fed wants to cool off the entire economy by raising interest rates. So that's going to affect housing. It's going to affect cars, anything that people have to finance. And so this is all part of the program.
Mm-hmm. Right. How does that and when does that feed through then into consumer confidence? Because that's a huge marker for you. If you're feeling good, your house price is appreciating, you just feel richer. That's just the way that it kind of goes. So when do we see that?
Well, I think we're already seeing it certainly in the expectations measure. The expectations measure is still below 80. So anything below 80 historically tells us that consumers are expecting a recession. So even though right now in the moment they're feeling okay, they still think something negative, something bad is coming around the corner, and they're starting to feel, and so certainly as housing activity and home prices start to slide, that's going to affect confidence, we think, over the next few months. And that also is going to coincide with what we think will be a recessionary environment.
Dana, the data I'm seeing from the University of Michigan is a little bit more cautious. The consumer that they're talking to feels a little bit more nervous about the world. Can you explain the difference between what you're seeing and what they're seeing, if there is a difference at all?
Sure. I think the big difference is what we ask in our two surveys. Our headline survey does not ask about inflation, but we do ask about employment. And certainly, again, many people employed, labor market's doing great. So that's being reflected in our headline. Whereas with Michigan, their headline does include inflation. And so people are still feeling very bad about inflation. And so that's certainly more reflected in their number. But we ask about inflation separately in our inflation expectations gauge. While it has come off a bit, it's still very elevated, and people are thinking that inflation is going to remain elevated for some time. And that's a sentiment that the Fed wants to battle by addressing inflation now.
You also mentioned earlier that wages and jobs are also holding up relatively well. You mentioned that 4.5% to 5% U3 rate. Do you think it's possible that we get a job full type of slowdown / recession? Like, how does your forecast look from that lens?
Yes, absolutely. And we've been using that terminology as well, the job full recession, where you have negative GDP, and in particular, you have negative domestic demand with slides in consumer spending, housing investment, and business investment, and not much support from the government. But also not a material weakening in the labor market, where you see the unemployment rate rise anywhere from 4 to 4.5%. Some people are saying a little bit higher, but certainly not the leaps in unemployment that we saw during the pandemic or during the 2008-09 recession.
All right, Dana, thanks a lot. Oh, sorry, Guy, go ahead.
Sorry, no. I was going to ask, Dana, are you surprised by this data? Is this, would you have expected this data at this stage in a hiking cycle from the Federal Reserve and a slowing of the US economy? Is it consistent with what you would have expected?
Well, yes, I do. Again, because when we think about the present situation, there's those three things that I mentioned at the top: jobs, wages, and lower gasoline prices. And for your everyday consumer, most people are driving, and if they see gas prices come off, that makes them feel better. But the expectations gauge is still telling us that consumers think something very bad is around the corner, and that's going to negatively affect them. And so I think that the data are telling us exactly what consumers are feeling, and it makes sense.